All right, so yeah, hey, I'm Bill Milstid. I'm not from southern Wisconsin, I'm from Florida, but he's funny, so we can roll with it. We're going to be talking a lot today about XAPI, okay? Kind of what that is in general and how you can use it in rapid authoring tools, okay? Now, that being said, probably important to go ahead and talk about what exactly we're going to cover and what we're not going to cover. There's a lot of sessions here that go really in depth into XAPI and the spec in terms of practically what it is and some kind of big picture ideas of what you can do with XAPI. We're really going to be focusing on it kind of more at like an individual contributor level. So if you're using some of the big three tools, Storyline, Captivate, and Inlectura, how you can actually practically start putting XAPI statements to work for you, okay, which we don't really talk about that a lot. So specifically today, a little hard to read, but what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at what XAPI is, just in very simple terms, okay? Then we're going to go over how those big three tools handle XAPI statements, both kind of custom and just out of the box, all right? And then real quickly, we're going to look at one way to launch and test your files using a better than free LRS that we kind of have set up for you guys in case you don't have one or have any access to it. Now, that being said, what we're not going to do, we're not going to take a very deep dive into the XAPI terminology, into the spec, into it, the kind of broad standard. And the reason for that is that tons of people have covered it. It's everywhere. We've got tons of people here who are covering that stuff. I really want to simplify it. The biggest challenge with XAPI that we often see is that it's very complicated. So I'm going to reduce that down a lot, and we're really focusing on tools, how we've kind of built out something to get XAPI started in those tools, and just generally, kind of rolling through with your day-to-day practice without having to change anything. Now, with that, I am also going to be simplifying a lot of the way that I'm talking about this stuff. So if you sit through a real in-depth XAPI presentation, there are some specific terms that get used for what we may refer to as other terms. So I'm going to use kind of our standard rapid authoring terminology while I'm going through it, and it'll probably, hopefully, make a lot more sense in doing so. So the first thing I want to do, though, before I really get too deep into actually going over this stuff, is I want to just kind of frame XAPI by way of an analogy. Okay, so I work at eLearning Brothers, and that's not a very common work environment because I get to spend my day figuring out really cool things to do to make other people do really cool things. But before that, I worked at a very normal environment. We had tiny staff, a tiny budget, and a huge user base and a huge workload. One of the common things that we would run into in that environment was we'd build out a course, right? We'd send it through our QA, our testing process. Everything would be great. Send it out to our users. Everything would be fine. And then we'd start getting kind of isolated problems that would trickle in. Most of the time for us, this would be high-level people often. You get an exec, a VP, or something, very important folks. They got a problem with their course. But the problem with that is that on the system that we were on, our LMS at the time, and most LMSs still today, we just didn't really have a lot of data to find out what was actually going on with those users, right? So short of kind of sitting down with an individual user in our case and seeing what was happening, we were often left to just kind of check them off or let's make the assumption that they finished it and move on, and that's not obviously an ideal scenario, right? So we're at a data loss for just troubleshooting as a real common problem. But outside of a troubleshooting issue as well, we were at a data loss for all of the things we like to talk about doing in e-learning development. So, measuring content engagement, right? Optimizing our courses, following up with individual users based on what they're doing in a course. These are all things that we want to do on a regular basis, but especially if we're working in a rapid authoring tool, you may not necessarily have the ability to do that, okay? We ran into that all the time. Now, about 2013 or so, XAPI came out. And XAPI, is kind of wonderful thing that we hear a lot about in the industry. We were starting to hear a ton about it a few years ago. It promised a lot of things. It promised the ability to get out of an LMS and to take our learning to our users. I worked in a manufacturing environment where we had a lot of people on a line, so a sit-down computer wasn't very great for them. It promised the ability to go in and do some real deep contextual tracking in terms of what everybody was doing in their course, a whole bunch of things. But the problem that we ran into was that nobody knew how to start in the environment we had, right? We were using Storyline on SuccessFactors. Storyline 1 at the time, I think at the time. That's kind of the same situation today, really. XAPI is available in the big tools that we mostly use, but getting started and using it in a real practical sense is still kind of a challenge. We've actually fixed that a little bit. We've come up with something that we think kind of bridges the gap between a full XAPI custom program and your standard rapid authoring offering. So I'm going to talk about that today. That's the point of today. So the first thing that we should probably do, I said that I wasn't going to get a ton into the XAPI spec, the details of it. Probably still a good idea for those of you who just kind of have a general notion of the term to go through an overview of it. And again, I'm going to simplify everything here. So we're going to look at the seriously simple XAPI overview. What XAPI is it's just a learning spec, just like SCORM. It's a learning spec. It uses JSON, which is a JavaScript object notation, okay, to send statements about what action a learner took to an LRS. An LRS is basically just a big database that can or cannot report back, depending on what you have set up. So basically, XAPI at its most simplest is just a format for JavaScript to tell your LRS that things happened. It uses a specific format. They use actor verb object in XAPI, but I tend to just rephrase it as somebody or someone did something, right? A little more common language there. Now, we're going to go ahead and look at kind of what that practically means now. So a practical example of XAPI in use might be something like this. So we got Zach here. Let's imagine that Zach went through and took, say, a Storyline or a Captivate course just on the overview of XAPI. What XAPI is, how you use it, etc. Now, throughout that course, we're going to send some statements back to an LRS, like we talked about earlier. They're going to trigger some things on our LRS and send us some statements through this kind of gobbledygook that ultimately look like this. So a few seconds ago, Zach Batty mastered XAPI Overview. This may also look like a few seconds ago, Zach Batty pressed tab 1 or interacted with a slider interaction, or however it is that we've set this up in the course, okay? Blown out over the course of an entire course, statements in an LRS look like this. Zach Batty voted up whatever our object was there. It's a read and select scenario object. So you get kind of a linear plain text view of what a user is doing throughout a course. You can filter on that, you can view it, etc. But probably more importantly for what we talk about all the time is you also get a whole bunch of data out of it that you can use however you choose. Optimization, again, following up with that user, whatever your needs are. These shots on screen are screenshots from data coming out of an LRS. That's one Storyline course, spitting out all that data, which is great. I've never been able to get that much information out of an LMS without doing a whole bunch of probably pretty impractical stuff with regards to publishing and setting up my files, right? And I'm getting a head nod, so I'm guessing yes. All right. There are also other ways that you can get stuff like this, but they're not a standardized spec. They cannot be used in multiple ways, right? So you can't send that data to another place. And, well, frankly, again, they require a lot more work than what a standard spec might require. So putting it to use, actually, it's a pretty great tool. So that being said, what we're going to do is just kind of break down real briefly, again, very briefly, the basic parts, the super basic parts of an XAPI statement. And then after we've gone through these, I'm going to show you what the main tools actually give you for XAPI statements, and then what we've done to help you have a little bit more detail to get some more reporting out of your standard authoring tools. Okay? So the first element of an XAPI statement, it's actor info. This really is just your identifier for who is doing what, right? You're someone, and that someone did something, or actor verb object statement. That's this. Generally, this is handled outside of your authoring tool. It's kind of a detailed bit that if you look a little more deeply into the XAPI spec with launch, that's where this is handled. For our purposes, probably not really going to address this part. It's not handled with the tools themselves, okay? But the next two parts, basic parts of an XAPI statement are. So the second part of an XAPI statement is your verb, right? So again, actor verb object. This has at minimum two areas. We've got an ID and a display, okay? An ID is, well, it's a URL to a predefined verb entry. This would exist on ADL or a few other repositories that are out online. We have a number of these resources. If you're not familiar with where to get ADL verbs or how to look any of this stuff up, we can post this stuff so you can learn a little bit more about it in a deeper context later. But in addition to the verb ID, it also includes a verb display. And that's how you actually want something to show up in your LRS, right? So earlier we had Zach Batty voted up. That's that second part, the display, right? We got the mastered in this case. We have a URL that points to an existing entry for mastered as well. The third part that you need at minimum in one of these statements is an object. This is the thing that is being acted on. So we have someone did something, right? This is the thing that got done on, right? All right, so in this case, we've got an ID that's, again, a URL. You need a unique identifier for each object that's being clicked, dragged, interacted with in a course. Typically, this is done in a URL format, okay? And then you also have a definition, very similar to how we have the name set up over there. This is how you want it to display in the LRS. So at bare minimum, we have these three elements in a statement. There's a ton of other stuff that can be added as well, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But at its absolute simplest, that's really about all you need to get a statement going. Now, cool thing about the tools that we use is that they promise to make really all that kind of detailed stuff that goes on behind the scenes unnecessary to know a lot of. And that's true with the big three tools that we have as well. Kind of ran down, here's what XAPI is and here's what statements are, just to make sure that we kind of had a vague notion going into it. But the truth is, Storyline, Captivate, and Lectora handle a lot of that for you. They form statements. They have a wrapper that allows XAPI to be pushed out from each of those tools. And frankly, all you really have to do in those three tools is publish to get an XAPI course going, technically. I'm going to walk through what that looks like practically, and then we're going to see kind of what those statements that those tools will give you actually look like and some limitations as well, okay? So in Storyline, it's an unbelievably simple process. Basically, you press publish, right? You bring up your publish dialog and select LMS on the sidebar. In your output options, you select Tin Can API. And then in reporting and tracking, you technically can choose to not enter anything in the reporting and tracking dialog, but generally you would. You'd open that up and you'd enter an identifier that's just specific to your course. It's about all you got to do. Press publish, and your course is out there, zipped up and ready to go for you to put out and send statements to an LRS, okay? Now, similarly in Captivate, very simple process. All we're really working with is publishing to XAPI, right, choosing it in our LMS publish options, and then entering a few minor details, just like you would in a standard SCORM course. An identifier, a description, pressing OK, and publishing. And technically, it'll spit out a course that will send XAPI statements for you. Lectora is actually the simplest across the board, and you'll hear me kind of talk about this throughout the presentation. Lectora, again, very simple. You publish. It's a single screen thing. Enter an activity ID as your identifier in the top here. OK, and you're good to go. Lectora has actually really made life easy for XAPI folks because they've built so much into their tool. It's great. It actually kind of makes them almost easy to leave off of this presentation. As we go forward, I'll explain a little bit more about that. But so technically, if you do that, you publish a course, even with nothing else in it, right? You've got one tabbed interaction in one file, you press publish to XAPI, and any of those tools, adding nothing, you will have a course that will send XAPI statements to an LRS if that's what you need. Now, the thing about that, though, is that those statements are a little bit limited. This is actually an overview of exactly what out-of-the-box statements look like as of today for the big tools. Mostly what we're looking at is slide-level data. So you will get an actor attempted, whatever the course name was, statement coming out of all three tools when a course is launched. You will also get a actor experienced slide title statement coming out of all three tools when you hit a slide. Similarly, if you have course completion or pass-fail settings established on your course, just like you would have done in LMS or SCORM publish, no additional settings here, you'll get a completed statement or a passed-failed statement coming out of the tools, okay? Not a ton of detail, though, in those statements, right? Because we're just looking at so-and-so opened a course, so-and-so hit a slide. When you get into quizzes or assessment items, all three tools actually do a really good job of giving you a lot more data. You get user response automatically coming out of those tools, and you can filter and sort on that data. It's nicely nested, nicely put together, and pretty deep reporting. But what would be nice, in my opinion, is if we got, really frankly, a lot more than that. Because we are just kind of talking still about slide level data here, right? But two things. One, because of the way they've structured these statements, it actually has implications for how you set up your files, and it has implications for your workflow, really. So because we're getting slide level data mostly only, what that means is you have to construct your course kind of back to the way you would have been doing it in like PowerPoint or Presenter, something like that, if you want to use purely out-of-the-box statements coming out of these tools. Okay, so let's think to this little interaction I had here on the previous slide, right? So we have a little 4-tab folder interaction. Now, the way we build that is you got single slide, 4 tabs, 4 content layers, right? Boom. You click them, launches a layer, you get your content on there, and you move on. The way that the big tools kind of recommend that you may build that out, or at least Storyline and Captivate recommend that you build that out, is actually, again, back closer to how you would have been doing it in something like Presenter, where you've got a single slide as your intro layer, and then a different slide for each of your content layers. I'm not a big fan of that, personally. What would be much nicer is to be able to keep your workflow intact and still get some statements at the object level. So when I press that tab and that layer pops up, I'm still getting the statement that says the user saw that content, but again, in that one spot. So that's what we did. We actually came up with a way to do that that requires no JavaScript development and frankly not a whole lot of understanding of XAPI on the user's part. So we have this thing that we have these things called template styles out there, and what we've done is we've actually gone in and we've added XAPI into every one of them. And I'm going to show you kind of how we did that in a second. I'm going to walk you through just kind of practically what that looks like here. So a style is it's a collection of templates that are all kind of related, right? Right now I think it's about 31 or 32 different files consistently in every style that we have. We have the same 30 or 32 files or so that are all kind of styled to match that family. So Shamrock, Jet Blue, Black, Flat Blue. Again, it's all the same grouping of types of interactions styled differently. The idea here is that we wanted to give you guys enough assets that you could pick up a style and build out pretty much an entire course if you wanted to without really having to do a ton of custom development, right? And they're all built the same way, and one of the reasons why we kept all the same files in the same style families, or across the style families rather, is so that, well, some of our users, they co-brand stuff for their users, right, or for their learners. So you have, let's say you've got a finance group that you support, and you also have, I don't know, a manufacturing group that you support within the same organization. Maybe they have different styles for the programs that they're using. We build everything out the same across all of our families so that you can pick up in different styles for your different programs, know how those files work, get to using them, lickety-split. So what we did, though, is in every one of these styles that we have out there, every one of these interactions, we added some custom XAPI statements that are a little bit different than what Storyline, Captivate offer. Lectura, again, a different solution. Basically, you can track every single user click, interaction, swipe, drag, content launch, user response that you want coming out of these, and track it, filter on it, report on it, and use it to do kind of what we've been hoping for the last, I don't know, since I've been in the industry with rapid authoring tools. So we're going to show you how you do it. Now, you can certainly go in and kind of build this stuff out in a few different ways. I've seen a lot of examples out on the internet of how to use rapid authoring tools to do XAPI, but most of them include steps that kind of average developer and me would really not want to do a lot of. So post-publish surgery, right? I would assume, okay, I'm getting another, same guy, big smile. I'll talk to you later. A lot of the stuff that we see out there for kind of hacks or ways to do things that are, not necessarily out of the box with the tools that we use, require you after you've published to go in and then make changes to those published files. So in this case, it's the same. A lot of the solutions that I see out there require you to go in and you've published a course. Now you got to go insert some JavaScript into the header there. Now you got to go dump a wrapper. You got to upload that wrapper into your folder. Then you got to go upload that and test it. And that's a lot of stuff, especially, in custom development, you're making changes a lot that can be very easy to miss. We came up with a different way to do it, but we're still using the same basic approach that I showed you earlier. It's really just a simple statement that we've added in to our tools, and, well, we're executing them in a way that you don't have to worry about what's going on in those statements. Beyond what's on screen, which is a very basic statement, we've actually added some context and some extension, well, not extensions, because that's an actual term, but we have extended the XAPI statements to provide you guys with some pretty enhanced reporting capabilities coming out of these tools, just out of the box. So let's look at how we did it in each of these tools very quickly here. So this is a 4-tab click to reveal that's in our apple tree style, and this is in every one of our styles that we have. Basically, user clicks a tab, content shows up. Back to that earlier, reference, or the earlier example I was giving you. This is basically it. It's all on one slide, 4 layers. But when a user clicks, we send a custom statement for each tab. You can edit it without ever touching the JavaScript, though, in these files. And you don't ever have to do post-publish surgery once you get done with your course and publish it out there. You're just good to go as though these statements were coming straight out of the tool natively. So I'll show you how we did that right now. Basically, we added a few extra variables to our files. The first one that we added, which is just kind of a practical thing, we added to Storyline. We actually added a little disable XAPI trigger because JavaScript can be kind of problematic when you're previewing things. I don't know if you guys have ever, local okay, there we go. I don't need to talk about it more. So we put in a little button that you can just turn that off, do your previews, get your course going the way that you need, turn it back on before publish, and you'll get your statements ripped out and ready without interrupting your work. Actual meaningful XAPI variables, though, kind of start here. We've got a base URL XAPI variable. Basically what that is it matches the activity ID that you enter in at publish. This is kind of, what we do with this is, we're hosting all of our files, so we actually just run our hosted directory in this piece, okay? Second thing that we've added in there is this little object ID XAPI. You can put pretty much anything you want in this variable, but it serves as a slide level identifier, okay? So think of that base URL as your course level identifier. It's kind of the big parent for your entire course. This is an identifier for that actual slide. Now, one little tricky bit about what Storyline does is so each of the tools automates basically this element. okay? And it kind of creates it on its own for you and adds it to its standard statements. We're matching what Storyline puts out in the way that we do it. We're doing it manually to give you guys the option to control that if you want. But basically, Storyline creates a unique identifier. It's like a 6 or 7 digit little serial for each slide that it creates. We just pull that out of a tin can file, an XML file, and we enter that here. And the reason why we do that is that allows us to match up all the custom statements that are shown in here with that out-of-the-box stuff, the experienced and attempted stuff, so that you can get kind of grouped reporting when you're going through your LRS. After object ID, we've added a description. This is exactly what it sounds like. This is pretty much the description you'd like to enter in there. Put whatever you'd like. It's a free-form variable. After here, we've got a verb ID. So think back to that original kind of early breakdown of the, real quick breakdown of the statements. This is that URL that we use to identify a verb uniquely. After that, we've got a verb display, which is exactly how you want it to display in the LRS. So thinking practically in terms of this file, this 4-tab interaction that we have on screen, right? If you want, instead of it to say pressed tab 1 or clicked tab 1, you just type in here whatever it is what you want. You want to say saw, if you want it to say who knows what, that's up to you. And that's how it's going to display in the LRS. Again, you don't ever have to touch the JavaScript that really runs these statements to make that work. Next up, we have a content ID, thinking back to that light statement, right? This is the URL identifier for the thing that you're clicking. Now, in our case, what we've done is we've actually shortened that down to just what our tab is going to be, and I'll explain why we've done that in just a second. But basically, so if you're tab 1, this is the URL version of tab 1, /tab-1, how you might format that in a web page to get there, okay? After object ID, we also have our content name, or there's actually should have been content ID, but we have a content name here, and that's how you want that object to show up in your LRS. So what the user clicked on, tab 1, tab 2, the plain English version of that. All right, so that's kind of a lot of stuff. Not really, because what's going on behind the scenes is actually a lot more than that. So you guys enter 4 variable values, maybe 5 or 6, if you really want to get wacky with customizing what we've got built in there. And what we do is we take all those variable values and we run some JavaScript, do some magic on it, and make a fully formed statement. I'm going to show you the first part of that to kind of just explain why we have some of those variables in there. And it'll, if you think back to how we had the statement shown on screen earlier, maybe make some connections with how we're doing it there as well. But basically, we just kind of take that base URL value, the object ID, and the content ID, we string them together, and we create a statement object ID that's unique to whatever that thing you pressed was, right? So our base URL was this ELB XAPI template, and then our directory, our object ID, which we pulled from the Storyline identifier, and then we have a content ID for our tab 1 or tab 2. Pull them together and we make a unique object ID to basically satisfy the needs of your statement there, okay? We're doing pretty much the same kind of a thing in Captivate. This is a 4-tab click to reveal in Captivate in a different style, same file really, but different. Here, really, we've got very similar variables set up. A little bit different in Storyline, a couple of those kind of top level variables we're getting set at the very top of the stack of your triggers. We actually set a couple of these at the base level, or rather at the variables pane in Captivate, but otherwise the process is really similar. All right, you enter a few ID values, you enter what you want each action to be worded as and identified as, and then we're stringing it all together for you in JavaScript so that you can then publish, again, using the tools built-in XAPI features, and get some deeper reporting coming out of these tools, okay? All right. Now, Lectora is kind of our, it's our odd duck of the group because Lectora is great with XAPI. It's way ahead of the other tools in my opinion. Lectora provides custom statements as a built-in option. So in that case, we've gone in and added all of them for you to save some work time, but most of the legwork, frankly, they've handled for us, okay? They also provide a lot more in the way of support and in the way of just general help getting started with XAPI. So I'm not going to cover it a ton here. Basic process is very similar in terms of like it's all the same background ideas. They use custom triggers instead of having to set up 4 or 5 different variables. It's all in one shot for you through them. All right, so cool. We went through generally how to set that up. What does it actually kind of look like, right? And what are things you need to be aware of? Well, there's a couple things to be aware of before we get into actually looking at what it really looks like in practice here. But one, there's pretty much any number of ways that you can use and customize XAPI. We've set up kind of a baseline statement in most of our files. Actor, verb, object, and something called context. So we've got grouping and parent items that are included in our statements there to help you with reporting. But the cool thing about XAPI is that it's incredibly extensible. So earlier I said extensions, and then I backpedaled on that. The reason why I did is that there actually is a feature of XAPI where aside from the kind of built-in statement elements that you can add onto, you can also customize your statements with extensions. There's a lot that you can do with it. And you know, accordingly, that you can kind of edit what we've done in these files as well. Two, just a heads up while you're, if you get into using XAPI in any meaningful context, one thing people get tripped up on sometimes is that, see those URLs, right, for our object ID and for our verb thing that I was showing you, those are really to give a discrete identifier to whatever thing in question we're talking about. So a verb, this is a predefined verb. If you go here, the same definition is always going to be used. It's always going to mean the same thing. It's not going to matter contextually. It's not going to be specific to your organization, right? But technically, you can use whatever you want for a lot of this stuff, but you really probably shouldn't for that exact reason. And you're getting a big head nod, so all right. There are a lot of problems with putting in some free-form stuff into XAPI fields, so it's generally best to stick to predefined libraries. We have some support on this. It's probably better read than talked about in a big presentation. So if you check out the ELB website, a lot of that stuff will be up there to kind of review and learn a little bit more about. Plus, there are great deep dives on this stuff on like xapi.com, and H2 Labs has a bunch of good overviews on this stuff as well. 3, so we don't address actor information in these files. We wouldn't. That would not be included in what we're doing here. That is something that we generally just aren't discussing in our XAPI talks here, and that's because it varies. The way that you authenticate to a course is going to vary significantly between individual to individual. What your learning environment looks like is going to kind of vary widely. And the fourth thing is that there are a ton of resources for this stuff out there. So like I've been kind of blowing through this and trying to take a pretty high-level view and show you a way that we've built out some stuff in tools to help you get started quickly and easily. But there are really good deep dive resources available. I got a few on the screen. We can, I'm sure, post some of those out when we're done with all this. XAPI.com is just a great place to start. We've got very good deep dives that go into some great detail, but also are framed and worded in kind of a standard, everyday speak manner, which is nice because this stuff can get kind of complicated. All right. So putting statements to work and how you do that. Well, let's imagine now, because we've published everything, right? And we've used these files. Let's imagine we've done that. There are 2 ways that you can use, I'm specifically speaking about the files that we've been showing here today, but really any XAPI file coming out of a rapid authoring tool. You can technically still just use it on an LMS or in a solution that you already have. If you want to just disregard XAPI statements, that's not a problem. But a lot of LMSs also have an inbuilt LRS. I know Cornerstone has one. I know SCORM Cloud has one. The challenge there is going to be whether or not you have access to it and what level of reporting it gives you, at what level of access you have. So we partnered actually with a company called Veracity, which is a really great LRS. It has a pretty robust analytics package to actually get you guys a better than free account. I think it's like 150% of the standard statements that they would give a free account. They give you guys, you know, a little bit more than that. Plus, there's some additional reporting features, I believe, as well. We've got a little idea out there, or a little link out there for you on some pages. You guys can check out the ELB site and find out more on it. But you basically do need an LRS of some capacity if you're going to spit these things out. I would suggest there, because again, it's free. We've used it a bunch. They're great folks who are super helpful. Now, whatever you do, once you publish, okay, so I've been saying, okay, you can publish this file and get your statements to work automatically. Well, you have to have that file communicate with an LRS. And in order to do that, you need to be able to, well, set up, it's got a specific phrase, but we're just going to call it a launch link, okay? That launch link has to have some specific details in it. We don't like to talk too deep about this because, well, it's going to vary between, you know, environments as to how you actually do this in a production setting. But to test them, really you just have to come up with a, you have to create a specific launch file that has some credentials in it that, again, are specific to your course and whoever your user is. We've got a support thing that's a little more detailed about this that's going to be coming out to help that out. And there's a ton of information on how to create this stuff online. Now, once you do, though, what you actually end up with is pretty great. So right here, this is actually us walking through, these are statements that we've created as we're walking through this file today up here. So you can see that, you know, constructed an XAPI launch link, just briefly went through that. We're looking right now at our XAPI statement viewer. So we get a lot of, again, this is that kind of linear bit that I was showing you in real time, pretty much from wherever. I'm hosting this file that we're looking at right now off the ELB server. It's not connected to an LMS. It's running there, okay? But beyond that, again, this is Veracity, you get some pretty great stuff. So this is the storyline course that you're looking at right now. It's one of the, it's actually comes out of our styles. It's a campfire style. And so this is pretty much, not everything, but a number of the things that we've been doing in the course throughout the day, looking at it between other, you know, times showing it to folks, and then right here while we're on stage. This is kind of the analytic breakdown of that. And a little more in-depth view of that is something like this. Now, this for me is a heck of a lot more info than I've ever seen come out of an LMS, and it's coming out of a storyline file that we pressed publish on and then uploaded. No post-publish surgery, no in-depth JavaScript, no nothing. We really went in there and typed a few variable values in, hit OK, and we were good to go. Kind of ran through it here real quickly today, but really in a nutshell, that's about all you need to know, actually, to get started with XAPI. We have a tendency to look at really big picture examples, use cases of XAPI that are very impressive and often very far outside of our day-to-day. You can get started with very little info, very little deep knowledge of what XAPI actually is, and using the tools that you have in place for little to no cost. Hope you guys got something out of that, and if anybody would like to talk to us about it, we've got folks standing over at the sales floor that can help you learn a little bit more about it as well. Okay? Thank you.